Hello, Nigel. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Talking Shop podcast with the BCO NextGen. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. It's good to be into a new year and all the dials going back to zero, or are they do in our case anyway?
Indeed. No, 2022 is To me, it feels like there's a good, positive outlook for the year ahead. A lot of good conversations taking place. A lot of confidence in the sector. It's a very, very different outlook to the years gone by with all the uncertainty. But no, thanks so much for taking part in today's BCO podcast. I'm delighted to be here to be able to talk to you more about some of the work that you're doing, creating smart buildings.
Pleasure.
Before we get started, because I know some of the listeners will already know your work from the November 2020 impact of technology on COVID-19 in the workplace. People will already be aware of this with the work that you did, and you authored this report for BCO. But for those that maybe haven't come across you before, can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
By all means. Well, I won't go back too far because it's a very long way, but my history is technology. So I was a systems engineer many years ago, and I've worked since in business channel management for some of the big computer technology companies over the years. More recently or not that recently, thinking about it, in data centers and putting in data centers and networks for similar type companies. And then much more recently involved in the fit out of new office premises from a technology point of view. Oddly, the frustration always being that it seemed to be, even until relatively recently, an afterthought. So we'll come back to that. But so these days I'm managing director of Cordless Consultants. We've been where I've been for, I think it's 16 or 17 years this year. And we're an organisation that fits out or helps with the design team in the fit out of occupier premises in the process of a move. And also works a lot now with developers in the preparation of their buildings in base build, again from of course a technology angle.
I don't know how you found the time to as MD to also write this report for BCO, because I mean, within the report you outline how organisations are adapting and embracing a range of new technologies to ensure that offices can comply with the hygiene and social distancing measures. Some of these new practices include like desk and room booking apps, occupancy sensors, workplace apps, touchless interfaces, all of these new introductions into the workplace to make smarter buildings. Like, where I want to kick off from is, who leads on the conversation? When do you get brought into whether or not we're looking at retrofit, say we're looking at a new building, when do you get brought in to start kind of taking a design and being like, right, we're gonna create a smart building from the architect's drawings, from what the structural engineers say? How do you kind of get brought in, and is it client based, is it architect based? Where do you fit into the project life cycle?
Yeah, and that's a very big question and a very good question. And kind of all of the above that you just mentioned. So it does depend on the project. The perfect scenario is that we get brought in early stage by a client, so an occupier, for example, and there are exceptions to that, but in the case of an occupier taking up new space, where we get brought in directly by them or by their project team, but very early in the project life cycle. And the reason for that, and it's always been my bugbear, that technology was often an afterthought. You know, it was sort of some project managers even today still say a second level or sort of second tier appointment, when technology is, in my book, and I would say this, but certainly now should be right at the top there. So why should it be early? Well, because the occupier themselves doesn't know what is possible. You know, they don't know. So we have to take them through the art of the possible, some discovery, in order that they can then, from a qualified position, assess whether those technologies and capabilities resonate with their aspirations, you know, whether they help them reach their aspirations. And they need to do that before they really start even designing the space, because they maybe end up using that space in a very different way, dependent on the technology. Also, there's a second reason for that, and that is if you're really doing a true smart building, and maybe I'll come on to the definition of that, but a true smart building should be able to reach back into the landlord controls. In other words, some of the FM and some of the smart, not even smart, the BMS system and the building controls, because you want to be able to amalgamate and integrate things such as CCTV, gates, guest management, which is typically landlord demise, and integrate that with some of the services that the occupier is putting in for their own spaces. And to be able to do that, you don't want that to have, certainly with a new building, you don't want to have developed too far, because there may be sort of roadblocks to doing so. So if we can get early influence on that, so much the better. So perfect world, occupier gets us in early. There is another side to that as well, of course, and that is the developers themselves. We do an increasing amount of work with developers. And again, because the technology reaches back to the very fundamentals, the BMS systems, it's starting to integrate very closely with the M&E systems. It needs to be early doors as part of that base build design. So,
how does that
so I guess the overall answer is early.
Well, that's the thing. When you've got a project, let's say early, and it's early in the design phase, it's not been built yet. Where does that kind of contrast come into? As say you're retrofitting a building, and you're looking at aspects where you're trying to create a net zero building and introducing your elements to make it a smart building as well. What are the challenges that you would face when kind of applying your technologies to a retrofit project as opposed to a new build project? What are the main contrasts and challenges that you come up against?
Yeah, there are a great number of those for retrofit, and I guess it depends on the age of the building and how much refurb is going on with the building. So to put that into perspective, obviously if a building's relatively old and the existing building management systems, the building services systems that are in there aren't refurbished, and maybe there's a BMS system, but it's an old type BMS system. In other words, the building management is really just controlling mechanical, electrical services. There's often not the facility really for getting any information into or from that system. So in those cases, a retrofit would probably be more occupier level. And the sort of benefits you get is closer management of space. So things like desk booking, room booking, resource booking of various types, maybe some guest management, but it's probably limited on what you could do with the actual services into the building, because you couldn't necessarily link into those or control or monitor those. With a more extreme refurbishment of a grade B, sort of refurbishment of a building, if a new BMS system is going in, then again, being early involved allows us to maybe advise on that BMS system to a degree, to one that's got the sort of facilities for us to link into it or to integrate into it. And that means things such as, potentially you could monitor fresh air supply, and maybe start putting in things like location services, in other words, sensors that sense where people are, what they're doing, that type of thing, and can then start to adapt the building depending on what's going on within it. But to do that, you've got to have a BMS system that's capable of receiving information and putting information out, in other words, integrating. So
are you able to give us any examples where it's say a project that you've worked on where you can kind of elaborate on smart building solutions for great experiences and amazing spaces, and people really kind of embracing kind of going into their new workplace and having all of this new technology at their fingertips, this new way of kind of appreciating a workspace and experience rather than just your typical office space, because these are more experience spaces, aren't they, from what they offer on a technology point of view. It just makes your way of working easier. Well, that's how it's meant. That's how it's meant to work as a user, isn't it? So you able to kind of, I know you might not be able to say specific clients, and but if you're able to give us more of an insight into that.
And you're quite right. I mean, with the whole pandemic situation, the last 18 months, 2 years, we've seen a fundamental shift from some of this smart technology being a desirable to being a must-have, and that's coming both from the landlords and from the occupiers. But I guess it's to meet demand from the occupiers who want their buildings to be more than just containers for people. So the sort of things that are now being adapted need to make the space, well, it's got to be safe. That's the first one. People have got to feel safe in that environment and want to come in, and they're not going to make that effort if they can't, don't feel safe. They're going to stay at home in their cocoon. It's got to help enhance performance. Productivity. So for the occupier themselves, that's really important. It's got to be attractive. It's got to be a nice place to go. So it's not just about it being a clinical environment. It's got to be sustainable and flexible, because these places are going to change, and it's got to be efficient. You need to be able to come in and just work. In other words, you don't want to have to go in and then start booking things and find yourself a desk and then press a myriad of buttons to get anything done. It just should happen largely in an automatic sequence. So with that being the case, an example of a smart building really working would be me sending out an invite. So putting a diary appointment in to invite 20 people to a meeting in my building. Now, just by putting that diary invite in, I can tick a box that enables that service to send out the invite, but also with a pass. Now that pass is received by the delegate who's coming in, so they're already beyond that horrible experience, the one that I still experience far too often, and that's queuing up at a reception, and then a phone call being taken just as you get there, and then filling out the form or some horrible screen that's all fingerprints. So that sort of gets bypassed. So the scenario would be as follows. I've received, as the guest, that invite. As I get close to the building, I get a welcome message. The building knows I'm nearly there. So it says, "Welcome, Mr. Miller, to Building X. Please pass straight through reception using your phone," or if there might be alternatives like a printed card, bypassing reception. So as I go in, my host has now been advised that I'm just entering the building. The building is expecting me. The turnstiles accept what's on my phone. It could be a Q code. It could be one of a number of other wireless technologies used to get me through reception. And as I step the next couple of steps, it tells me to go to cab A of the lifts, which is there and waiting for me, and takes me up to the relevant floor, where my host is waiting because he knew I just stepped into the building, and leads me through to the meeting room, where also by that invite being put together, a couple of more tick boxes have actually already set up the video conference and so on. Now, beyond that, the room's also really clever. It knows 20 people are about to descend on it. So it has proactively upped the airflow in the room and made sure that the temperature is going to just stay stable, rather than waiting until it gets hot and sweaty and the CO2 levels start to go up and everyone's sitting there sort of loosening their ties. So, in that flow, you've got an experience for the guest where it's almost seamless coming into the building. Everything seems to work nicely. You've got a greeting, your host's there waiting, the room's ready, and the room feels great. It's not suddenly getting hot and horrible. But it takes some doing that, because you've got to link diaries and secure information, if you like, from Outlook through to a device such as a mobile phone or a smartphone, I should say. The systems have also got to talk to the mechanical electrical services, the BMS, and a number of others. So there's a lot of links in that chain, but it's completely possible and is being done now. So those services are starting to now surface as the new normal.
It's that new normal. Say in your industry, how you've seen things grow and develop and evolve over, let's say, the past 10 years, I would kind of assume that when this type of integration for making smart buildings, probably it started in London and then has kind of grown out and expanded across the country in the years following. That's just me broad stroking some big assumptions there. But if that is the case, what can you tell me about that kind of how the introduction to smart buildings and the uses of your technology and the applications of what you do, how have you seen these trends kind of spread across the UK from London to Birmingham to Manchester to Leeds? What can you tell me about that kind of it's been on?
It is interesting. These things do domino a bit, but if I rewind the clock maybe about 15 years, we did some work in Sydney, so you can't get much further than that, for a large bank out there, and they were completely it was a new build, and we introduced them to activity-based working and so on, and as part of that, some of the smart technologies, and they adopted that lock, stock and barrel, and that started a whole trend in Sydney. And it was almost a domino effect, other major occupiers suddenly saw that building and were so blown away with what was possible, they wanted to adopt it. So ABC did the same. I think Commonwealth Bank and a number of others also adopted a lot of that smart technology. So we saw Sydney leap from typical 80s office space to probably some of the leading smart space and agile space. In the course of 5 years, they went from zero to sort of right out in the front. London was slower, but it was catching up, and there are some, real landmark occupiers and buildings in London, but it was still slower. It didn't domino as quickly. Maybe it's more dense. Maybe there are other factors that come into that, but it was certainly starting to really get some traction. But we were still talking about it in projects as, you could do this, and occupiers and landlords were saying, yeah, we could, but is it really necessary right now? Is it the greatest thing? Should we be, there was always this hesitance, which now has gone. So what we have seen, so 10 years ago, it was, sort of creeping forward, and it was accelerating. And I would say 6 years ago, we were putting in smart buildings and smart building technology in its earliest stage, at least. But the real acceleration happened literally only 2 years ago. The coming of the pandemic changed the rules. It essentially, let's just say FM managers and people in FM that I know out there say they have never, ever been asked about the fresh air quality in their building before. And now it's a common conversation. So people are extremely conscious, for example, of just the fundamentals in their building, the quality of the air, the quality of the environment. And of course, all of these things can be impacted and controlled much more with technology. So the last 2 years, it has changed radically. And we've seen requests for our engagement from project managers, for example, where smart technology was a sort of byline at the bottom, and now it's right up the top. We need to have a smart building that's going to adapt and keep people safe and secure, etc., etc. And it's the sort of first line.
Well, so with this huge advancement in the past 2 years alone, how does this kind of this growth in kind of technology within, say, the office sector, how does this growth in technology kind of relate to this the routes, that the kind of the journey to get to net zero that so many organizations are now on? How is technology in this industry kind of been applied to creating a more sustainable building? How are you seeing that work out?
Yeah, ultimately that will it will impact more and more. It's interesting, isn't it, that BREEAM and a number of the other measurements of sustainability were technology sort of didn't really register very high on the on the list of requirements. There were a lot of other things, but it's moving up quite rapidly now. How does it do it? Well, it has to reach back, if you're really looking at the sustainable parts. the first thing, it does need to reach back into the controls of the building. If we can take out design clashes, control clashes, where most buildings historically in London or anywhere else have not, they're not commissioned. They never get fully commissioned. So you do end up with situations in parts of the building where there's heating and cooling going on at the same time. They're clashing.
Yeah.
And that is a colossal waste, as you would imagine, because you're heating something to only to cool it down. So it's sort of a double or triple whammy. When you've got really good technology looking after those systems, intelligent BMS systems, those things are automatically taken care of. It knows there's an exception if both things are happening at the same time in the same area. So it eradicates it or it pulls up an exception. So immediately you've got a saving in how the building's running. The same would go for you know, how much energy you're using in any case. It will control it that much more finely, whether it's lighting, whether it's heating or cooling, those obviously being, you know, pretty large factors. And we'll start to look at how the building's being used. So if part of the building is, or let's say it's a really quiet day and there's flexible working, the building may even choose to stack people on one wing and put the other wing into standby. Now, if that wing's in standby, because why would you dot people, you know, sort of throughout a massive space? If you put half of it into standby, one, you're not using the energy in that space, you'll be much more efficiently in the other wing. And secondly, the capital cost, in other words, the wear and tear on, you know, fan coils and other mechanical electrical services is reduced enormously. So the capital life or the lifespan of those products extends. So that in itself starts to improve how the buildings. Yeah. So that can really start to have a large impact. And then there's the management of the space, which I guess is an extension of the same thing. You know, why have buildings that are of a certain size with, typically people come to us and say, we need more meeting rooms. And when you really analysed it, half those rooms were booked with no one in them, or they were 25 people meeting rooms with one person or two sitting in there. So if that's much more closely managed, you find that the space can actually reduce and be more efficiently used. And as a result of that, maybe you need less space anyway. So that's got a benefit on the whole carbon piece. So there's a whole range of aspects where I think it comes down to management, technology being used for management of people, of space, of resources, and of utilities starts to really have an impact. So go on.
Because all of these applications from a sustainable point of view, from how to manage the space, from a user experience, is absolutely brilliant. But where do you find the kind of maybe the pushback for the application and the adoption of these technologies within retrofitting the new buildings? Where do you say this kind of comes from? Do you find that there's a cost implication for creating a smart building? Is there the availability and the skill set for the people to go out onto site and kind of to create these smart buildings, or is there a materials aspect? Where do you find that you get the most pushback when it comes to that initial adoption and the embracing?
Well, it is there on all of it. You mentioned materials. Of course, we're all suffering from a chip shortage at the moment, and even getting your washing machine repaired currently is a major obstacle. So yeah, materials and chips are hopefully a short-term issue, but one that we're managing to circumnavigate. But it does make doesn't make life any easier. Getting good people who can help design, even for us as a fairly large employer in this area, getting the right people with the right skills and of course it'd be easier to say with the right sort of experience in it, but it's a fairly new thing. So they've either people that were in from its infancy, or they've got really great brains and have really caught up and really understand this stuff. But we have seen one of the challenges we've had, although we've been working in this area for so long, one is getting people ourselves, but two is so many competitors who have popped up out of nowhere, couldn't spell smart 2 years ago, and are suddenly all experts. And I do worry that there is some very thin knowledge being sold as expertise, and it could end up in tears. So
that's the thing. Hopefully, those new people emerging to the market that are just kind of jumping on smart buildings and this technology without that real depth and understanding. Surely they'll be, like, it becomes very clear very early on to everyone else in the meeting room, and that's why people like yourselves get brought in, because you clearly know the legacy of understanding of how to apply this kind of technology to buildings is there. Whereas if someone else,
it does. It will become clear. Unfortunately, the early stages of actually analysing some of this, it might not be clear. It's when you get to the design and the implementation that maybe those early stages weren't properly done, and then it comes to a head. And unfortunately, that could be some years down the line. So I think we'll see evidence of that in a few years. Hopefully, there won't be too much of it, but I fear a little that there may be. So that's a bit of the risk factor in the whole environment. You did ask about the other pushback, and that is, I guess, technophobes, or people that are most excuse me, most people who have been working from home for the last 18 months or 2 years have actually advanced their technology capability. We've seen, for example, lawyers who would only get someone else to set up a video call very quickly becoming experts on Teams or Zoom. And when they go back to the workplace, they've kind of moved forward quite a lot. So their acceptance of some of these technologies to keep them safe, comfortable, and connected seems to be have leapt forwards, and there's a bit less resistance. But we still get it, of course. We still see it. I think the later generations, we've got 5 generations in the workplace now, and the youngest and coming forward are quite accepting of technology a lot of the time. And sort of embrace it. Maybe the more mature members of our workplace are less accepting of agile working and using some of the tech. But, you know, that tech needs to be seamless. It needs to be simple. And that's the whole point. There's no good putting barriers by putting this technology in. It's got to be pretty much a seamless thing. You know, you need to be able to move between spaces wirelessly, and your devices just find the best connection. If you need to do something, you should be able to do it from, you know, 1 or 2 clicks on a smartphone or whatever, without having to run around, you know, pressing this and finding different connection materials and so on. So I think if that's adopted, that helps a great deal if it's done properly. But you're still going to get some things. You know, facial recognition might be one that's quite controversial. There are various GDPR type laws and so on that have to be navigated as well. We find some clients that can't wait to do it, and most of their staff are quite happy, because if that's one more barrier that's out the way, they can just walk up to the building and the doors open, so to speak, based on the fact they're relatively happy with that, as long as they're opting in and they're convinced that that isn't going to be used in some detrimental way. But there's always, you know, a few people that might object to that, and there might be some unions somewhere along the line that need to be involved. As a result, we're seeing HR becoming a much bigger piece of the whole smart building story, if you like. You know, HR, IT, and FM are sort of, and I guess corporate real estate, are all becoming sort of much closer together. HR was always kind of out there a bit. We used to say they've got an important role, but even then it was hard to get them into it. Now, with this sort of thing going on, it's how we work. It's very much a part of how people are going to be attracted to the business, retained, how safe they are, all HR pieces. So they've got a big role to play in this as well.
Yeah. Well, no, Nigel, thank you so much for talking to me today as part of the BCO Talking Shop podcast. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to share kind of the journey of smart buildings. And I think it's fascinating to kind of that it goes all the way back to Sydney 15 years ago, right through to today. That's quite the journey. They could do a movie on that, I'm sure. But no, really, really appreciate you. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. My pleasure. And it's a fascinating subject. Of course, as you may have gathered, I could talk about it for hours, but in the time available, hopefully it's given a bit of a snapshot.
No, that real insight into how it kind of the impact on creating more sustainable buildings and that user experience. I think it's fascinating, and it's brilliant to see it kind of moving forward and being applied and being able to be used for such a positive positive
Yes.
outcome. So no,
I guess we'll see. We might see the pandemic as the death of dumb buildings. I'm hoping that will be the case.